And just a little overview of today. We're going to be together until 1 p.m. I'm going to be talking at you for about 15 minutes, just giving you a bit of a data dump on the Conservation for All grant program, as well as an overview a bit about Maine Community Foundation, and then we'll give lots of space for questions and discussions. So you can submit your questions directly into the Q&A box, and then we will go through them at the end, or alternatively at the end you can use the raise hand feature and then we can unmute you. So if you think of a question, pop it right in the Q&A box as we go along, but we'll I'll enable the chat.
Yeah, I think I just did it, but please check.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Does the chat work now? Does someone want to try it?
There we go.
Carolyn. Awesome.
Sorry about that. Thank you.
Kat, Sarah, Paul, Rebecca, Lisa, so many awesome folks here today. Thank you. I love it. So some of you are familiar with Maine Community Foundation, but if not, just a brief overview. We are the statewide public foundation, and our mission is to bring people and resources together to build a better Maine. We were founded in 1983. We have a staff of almost 50 with a headquarters in Ellsworth and an office in Portland, where Katie and I are zooming in from today, as well as remote staff covering different counties. We have a network of over 500 community advisors and reviewers across all of our grant programs. And we meet our mission through strategic giving, community leadership, and local expertise. We make grants in a variety of ways. We have over 2,000 donor advised funds. There's 5 different types of funds. And in particular, we have over 600 scholarship funds for higher education, adult learning, and non-traditional education. All of that information is on our website, and I'm not going to go into too much detail here. I just wanted to provide a wider scope of the foundation as a whole. We also provide financial management for over 300 nonprofit organizations in Maine to help them build a perpetual source of funding. And then the competitive grants, we have 20 of them. That's what we're here to talk about today. They each have different deadlines and criteria around issue areas and geography. We receive proposals and go through a process where community advisors review and make decisions on those proposals. So competitive grant programs are also, competitive grant proposals are made available to our individual and family donors through an online portal called Giving Together. And I recommend checking out our grants page on the website to see all of our existing programs. We also really are a collaborator and convener and address a variety of statewide issues in partnership with hundreds of organizations, including Maine Philanthropy Center, Educate Maine, Maine Development Foundation, Maine Association of Nonprofits. So we have a wide reach, and one of our strongest foundation-wide initiatives is around racial equity. We strive to use a racial equity lens in all aspects of our organization. We have regular education programs and discussions for board members, staff, volunteer advisors, and donors. And our commitment to equity is really a moral and economic imperative. We're committed to dignity, respect, and equitable access to opportunities across all of our programs. And we really work to ensure that these values are not just words, but that they're manifested in the actions of all of our work. So the most obvious place that equity has in our work is in our grant making, which we'll get into. Our grant making practices are grounded in our commitment to equity, emphasizing trust, accessibility, and always questioning how bias might be operating. So our grant making advisors use equity grant making best practices for evaluating all of our proposals across each of our competitive programs. So just to share a little bit about, we have 2 environmental land focused programs. And I'm just checking the Q&A, making sure, is my volume okay? Can everyone hear me okay? Feeling like the volume's good? Okay, great. So 2 of our competitive grant programs are focused on land access, one of which is open at the same time as Conservation for All, and it's called Maine Land Protection, which is focused on funding easements and acquisitions that create long-term access and use of land or water for historically excluded or marginalized communities. So really focused on community conservation in the actual easement and acquisition process. What we're talking about today is our second grant program, Conservation for All, which offers project and general support to build strong connections between people in Maine and the land and the water. So both have the same deadline. Conservation for All grants are for organizations or projects that are doing that facilitation and creation of access to land and water. So I'm going to get way more into Conservation for All program in particular, but I just mentioned Maine Land Protection because it is open right now. And I'm going to put a link in the chat. We're accepting applications for reviewers. If you're interested in actually becoming a reviewer for Maine Land Protection proposals, that's an opportunity to get involved in the grant making process that's open now. So I put a little link to the form for that, but now we're going to get right into Conservation for All particular. And I'm happy to meet with you all about Maine Land Protection outside of this webinar. And I'll share my contact info at the end. So the purpose of this grant program is really to invest in organizations and projects that are building strong connections between people in Maine and the land and water. So we're offering general support grants to land trusts or land trust associations in Maine whose work meets the program criteria. And we're offering project-based grants to any organization. It does not have to be land-based, for implementing a project that meets the program criteria. So the program criteria in our language means this is the required criteria for this grant program, is that your organization or project must be creating or facilitating access to or use of land or water for marginalized and historically excluded populations. So this means taking specific actions to increase opportunities for those who are not accessing or using the land or the water. Some examples are reducing physical or economic barriers, creatively encouraging participation, or increasing awareness or access. And one of the other criterias, which means again required for this grant program, is engaging the people who are benefited or impacted by having them either designing, implementing, or evaluating the work. So the people that are being served by your project or organization are involved in the design, implementation, or evaluation. And I'll talk more a bit about that, but these are competitive grant programs, so we do have additional priorities. These are not requirements. The priorities come out of, this is what the grant committee is thinking about when reviewing your proposal. So the grant review committee is prioritizing smaller organizations, so less than 750K in their annual operating budget, and prioritizing organizations led by the people they intend to serve. So having representation at the staff and board level, at the decision-making level in your organization or in your project. An additional priority that the grant making committee has is around climate change and a climate framework. Knowing that climate disruption is and will be most impacting the communities you're supporting, do your programs, your projects support communities in preparedness or education related to climate change? Again, this is a priority, this is not a requirement. So this priority is really about acknowledging that climate is part of an equity framework, and this is something that the grant advisors think is really important, but it's not required. So these are priorities that help the grant making committee make their decisions. I'll also just add as a priority, projects and services must be based in Maine. So the projects need to be based in Maine. If your organization is not based in Maine, you would need to have strong existing community presence and strong existing Maine partnerships in order to be a competitive applicant to this program. So I'll just reiterate, projects and services need to be based in Maine. If your org's not based in Maine, you need to have strong existing community presence and strong existing community partnerships in Maine in order to be a competitive applicant to the program. There's also a copy of the full application, which is 7 narrative questions on the Conservation for All webpage. So you can see exactly what the questions are that address these priorities. And I'm curious, Katie, if you'd have anything to add on the priorities, or if you feel like I kind of covered it.
I think you covered it very well. Yeah, it's always like a little confusing, the difference between criteria and priorities. And I think you made that pretty clear. You know, these are things the committee will take into account while they're reviewing your proposal, but not required.
Yeah, maybe I'll just backtrack. So the criteria are the required. So you have to be engaging people impacted or benefited by involving them in the design, implementation, or evaluation, and you have to be focusing on facilitating access and use for marginalized and or historically excluded communities, which I'll talk a little more about what we mean by that. And I wanted to just share some stats from last year. The committee awarded competitively 28% of applicants, so that's pretty competitive. The committee awarded 12 grants out of 43 applications, and any eligible competitive proposals that aren't funded by the committee, we put on our donor advised fund portal for 1 year. So our donors are able to help fund any of the strong proposals that weren't funded by the committee. And last year, 7 additional proposals were funded by donors. That's what I mean by this last bullet point here. So 12 grants were awarded through the competitive process, and then an additional 7 through donor advised fund portal. Happy to talk more about that too as we get along here. And this is on our website again. This is just a list of what was funded last year for Conservation for All. I'm also going to send out these slides and a recording to this. So all of this information you're going to have to look at. But just to give a sense of the wide scope of funding. So some of the awards were directly to land trusts. Some of the awards were to organizations that are not land or water based at all, but that they're doing some form of land and water education or access or programming. So again, this is all on the website, just a quick snapshot. I wanted to get more clear on what we're talking about here with the Conservation for All language, knowing that our language is always evolving and we're always learning. Conservation for All is really about improving safe and equitable access to outdoor spaces and increasing opportunities. So I've listed here what Maine Community Foundation generally means by marginalized and excluded populations, the populations and communities that we want to be centering in our work. These are listed here in no particular order, and it's not an exhaustive list, but specifically we're thinking about, with Conservation for All, projects that are centering Black, Indigenous, and people of color, transgender, non-conforming people, people with low incomes, or people experiencing poverty, people experiencing disabilities, mental health conditions, immigrants, refugees, or asylum seekers, English language learners. And when I say people, I really mean Mainers, people in Maine. Again, projects and services based in Maine. And this is, again, not an exhaustive list, always evolving, but really we're thinking about actively partnering with communities to improve access to conserved land and increase opportunities for outdoor experiences, not as an afterthought or an add-on, but as central to the work and to your partnerships. And I list these out because looking at the past grant years and what's getting funded, I would recommend that the committee seems to be needing you to be as specific as possible to what your partnerships look like, and maybe perhaps including a letter of support as applicable. I'm going to put a link in the chat actually to our eligibility and grant guidelines, because we do have specific guidelines for if you're partnering with a tribe, if you're partnering with a school, there actually is a required letter of support. So I put a little link to our grant guidelines. And I also will just share a resource that's been really helpful for me, thinking about this book. I kind of gives a really good overview of the history of exclusionary practices of the park system, of the land conservation system. And I've found it really helpful in my own learning and journey. So I put a little link to this resource. And I'd also just share that if you kind of still have questions about what we're talking about, I'm happy to meet with you one-on-one to talk more about this. But again, thinking about actively partnering with communities that maybe aren't accessing your trails or aren't accessing your programs, and why aren't they accessing them? Who are the usual suspects, and how are you moving beyond the usual suspects to reach more of the community? Because we are the community foundation, so all of our programs, funding are centered on community access. I also wanted to clarify general support versus project. So last year there was some confusion about general support eligibility. And this year we really tried to hone in on general support is for land trusts or associations of land trusts that are deeply undertaking this work across their whole organization to increase access to their parcels of land and their programs, and centering equity within their leadership and within their planning. So for general support, you're a land trust that's deeply engaged in the program criteria in an ongoing fashion through a variety of your programs and your organization as a whole. So if you're applying for general support, you're talking about ongoing specific actions as a whole organization, like your organization is doing and living the program criteria as a whole. And you know, as specific as you can get to give the grant review committee a sense of what specifically are you working on and what you're trying to do across your organization. Again, if there is some critical partnerships to getting the work done, a letter from that partner can strengthen the application, and as clear as possible language on what the work looks like for your organization, what your partnerships are in an ongoing way. And for projects, so that's for general support. Your whole organization is really meeting the program criteria on a day-to-day basis with your programs and projects. For project support, this is open to any type of Maine organization. So any organization, your organization does not have to be conservation based. Your organization does not have to be land or water based. You would be applying for a specific project about increasing access or facilitating connection to water or land. So if you're applying for project support, you'd just be describing a specific project and its activities and goals. And again, project support does not have to be from a land-based or land trust organization. I would also just add, if you're not sure whether your organization is a fit for general support, you could pick one of your projects or programs that meet the criteria and apply as a project. If you have more questions on the general versus project, I'm also happy to just meet with you and chat about what you have in mind and help provide guidance on which track would be best to apply to. Anything you might add, Katie, on the general versus project, since you went through this process more last year? Or do you feel like I covered it?
I think you covered it very well, and you can, I know it can be a little confusing, but I think that you were very clear. I think you did a great job.
Great. Just feel free to chime in if I'm missing anything
I
here.
will.
So yeah, I wanted to add some more context as well on just what is our grant process here. So we have a multiracial advisory committee of leaders in the environmental sector who have lived experience of inequities in conservation or outdoor access. So this advisory committee is making the funding decisions. First off, though, proposals are screened by staff. That's myself. Just for basic eligibility. So do you meet the program criteria? Do you have required documents? And then all of the eligible proposals are then reviewed and scored by this advisory committee based on the program criteria. This committee then meets to make the funding decisions. The decisions are notified to you by email, and then if you receive an award, that is sent via paper mail. And eligible proposals that aren't awarded by the committee remain on our donor advised fund portal for 1 year. So donors are able to access and fund the proposals, which again, last year it was about 7 total that were funded through the donor portal. And then we have our grantees submit reports 1 year from the funding. Our reports are not required, but they're highly recommended. So we ask you to do just about 4 short questions a year after the funding that you receive, because we incorporate what we learn with a larger report out to the community on our website. And it's really an opportunity for you to reflect on the work and how things have gone. And I'll also just give us a sense of the timeline, and then we can open it up for questions. So we're accepting applications until September 15th. We do that eligibility screening process that I mentioned. Then all of the eligible proposals go to the grant advisory committee. They review the proposals throughout October. They meet throughout November to make the funding decisions. And then by the first week in December generally is when the decisions are emailed out and then awards are mailed out. And then reports are due a year after the funding for the awarded projects. I also want to make sure that you have my contact info here. my email and my phone as the point person to help you get an application in and to answer questions. I really want to reiterate that I am here to support you. It's my job to meet with you. So just don't be shy to reach out and chat with us about what you're thinking and receive support on the application. So that's all I have for slides. That was a lot of content. So let's see, are there any questions in the Q&A box already, Katie?
Let me unmute myself. Sorry, I'm a little distracted answering a couple questions. Yes, and first I thought I would just do a quick review of a couple questions that I already answered, just in case people had similar ones. One of the questions from Sarah Robinson was if there was flexibility around the operating budget, and the answer to that is yes. That limit of 750,000 is a priority. So we prioritize smaller organizations, but we certainly have larger organizations that apply and do sometimes get funded, but because it's such a competitive grant program, it is helpful if your budget is a little smaller. What were some of the other ones? Kat Libby asked if the committee would consider the elderly aging as a marginalized population. And certainly I think that we would consider that a population to focus on. And then I have a couple that I did not answer. So Sarah Collins asked if there's a lower than average poverty level in an area where working on recreation infrastructure would be applicable, or is that too broad? Or if there is a, sorry, did you catch that stuff? You can read it too, right? And I'm happy to quickly answer that question. Certainly.
Can you repeat the question real quick?
Yes.
Okay.
If there is a lower than average poverty level in an area where we are working on recreation infrastructure, would that be applicable, or is that too broad? And I would say we're definitely looking for projects working with these marginalized communities, and people living in poverty certainly are part of that. But we're really looking for projects that are taking really specific action with a very specific group of people. So just sort of like one of the things I used to say about this program is just sort of creating a trail and that it's free is not enough, that we're looking for specific actions that you're taking to engage that population. So hopefully that answers the question, Steph, if you had anything to add to that one.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think you answered it well. Maybe I would just further add that if your goal is to be reaching low-income rural folks, then have some of those folks involved in your project, and that's kind of part of this priorities in the criteria. It's like those people you're trying to reach should be part of designing, deciding, implementing, evaluating, because those of us, who've been in the field for a long time know that, yes, we need to go further than just making the trail. We need to actually have people involved and committed. So again, the folks you're trying to reach ideally are part of the plan or the design or the implementation or the evaluation of the project. There's a lot of good questions in here. What's the next one you want to go to, Katie?
First, I'm going to call Amy Titcomb. You've had your hand up for quite a bit, and I'm wondering if you did have a question. I'm going to unmute you for a second and give you a chance. Oh, your hand has disappeared. So I'm thinking maybe you didn't, but please chat or raise your hand again if you do have a question. Let's see, we did that one. I'm learning how to manage this stuff. So Julia Turner asked, I noticed that some educational organizations have been funded in the past. I'm curious about if the education carried out by these awardees was exclusively focused on land and water education, or if land, water education was one of the many other environmental education goals carried out by the organization / project that was funded. That's a good question. Without sort of looking at the list, I would assume that all those educational organizations were, the project is focused on a particularly marginalized community and getting them out to or educating them about Maine's land and water. But Steph, you might have a better answer for that question.
I know it's in it. I don't know. It's also interconnected, right? Like environmental education, land and water education are really interconnected. And I would also say that I don't think, given it's a pretty short application and there's a lot of, we try to practice a lot of trust with the grantees. Like, I don't think we're getting too nitty gritty into what the specific curriculum might be. We're more thinking about what's the plan for engaging the participants and having the community involved in the process, and trusting that whatever curriculum, if you want to do an educational project, that maybe that curriculum was designed by or requested by the community, but that the actual content itself isn't necessarily being reviewed by the grant committee. That kind of makes sense. So we're just really, the grant committee is really reviewing the process of like how you're engaging and involving people in whatever you're designing for the education, and trusting that whatever you do content or curriculum wise is based on what the community needs. And if that doesn't answer your question, Julia, feel free to add another question in as well to help us better answer. But just for the sake of time, maybe we should go to the next one, Katie. It looks like you're starting.
So yeah, Bill Bayruther asked if proposals that are funded by the committee are made available to our donor advised fund advisors. And the answer to that question is yes, but they will see that how much funding that project has already received. So if you're fully funded by the committee, I'm not sure I've ever seen a donor that added more funding to something that had been fully funded already. Up next, we have Sammy Wolf. On the website, the total award is listed as 15,000, but the application for 2023 says 10,000. Which number should we use? You should use 15,000 and we should update our application.
I did fix that, Sammy.
Okay.
Someone found that typo a few days ago, and it looks like it's all fixed now. So it's 15,000, not 10,000. And apologies for that.
Andrea Berry says, do you consider communities in urban areas a priority community? I'll let you answer that one, Steph.
I don't know what. I guess I think, again, getting as specific as possible on what you mean. Like urban can be really broad and can mean different things to different people. Like it has different connotations. So as long as you're just getting really specific on what you mean by urban and who's involved in the engaged in the design, implementation, or evaluation. So if you're planning to benefit or impact a specific urban community, then they would be involved in the design, implementation, or evaluation. I don't know if you'd add to that, Katie.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just wouldn't think of like, oh wait. Andrea added it.
Okay.
Andrea's talking about working with Portland Public Schools. I would say I don't think we would consider people who live in an urban area as like their own marginalized community, but I think what Steph was saying about maybe digging a little deeper about who you're working with.
Yeah. And I think, Andrea, just because I've worked so much with Maine public schools, like when I was writing grants, I would really hone in on a specific school community. What's the free and reduced lunch rate? That's one barometer of kind of the income of the school community, and having the school community, the people in the actual school, not outside partners, but people in the school involved in the design, implementation, or evaluation. And for working with schools, we do require a letter of support because it's such a common issue that folks want to partner with schools, but the schools might not be on, have the capacity to actually receive or implement the services. So if working with the school, getting as specific as possible on that school community and having members from that school community involved in the design, evaluation, implementation of the project. Let's keep going. We got more.
We got more. Rebecca Runquist was asking about, if I'm interpreting this correctly, Rebecca, please let me know, or I can unmute you if you want to talk about a need for fundamental improvements in their organization to be able to implement their projects and programs around equitable access. And I would say sort of the answer to that question is if you're a land trust, or I believe a land trust organization, you can apply for general operating funds. So that would be something to look at, because the idea of the general operating funds is you can use them for anything that you want. And particularly, obviously, like basic improvements to be able to do more of this work would be a great request if you feel like you fall into that category. But maybe
and getting as specific as possible too on like, where's your organization? If you're applying for general support for infrastructure improvements so that your organization can better serve systemically marginalized or oppressed communities, getting like really specific on what that looks like. So for example, rather than saying, we want to improve our capacity to recruit diverse participants, it would be moving deeper and getting more specific. What do you mean by diverse participants? Or who, like what specifically are you doing as a whole organization? Who are you specifically trying to reach? So definitely thinking about general support, but still trying to get a little more specific on what you're working on as an organization, who you're trying to reach, and what you're doing. Again, knowing that it's a community advisory committee reading these, who doesn't know necessarily your organization or the context. So giving as much specifics as possible is super helpful. We got to keep going on the questions.
All right. Zach is asking, do the programs / improvements have to happen on public land? Asked another way, would programs and access improvements on private property be relevant if the programs were open to the public?
What do you think about that? I
That's
don't
an
know.
interesting question. I think if it's private property that's open to the public, I think that would be okay. I think I'd be curious to know more about the specifics and maybe contacting staff
Yeah.
directly.
Yeah,
So
we
obviously
should talk.
you'd have to be a nonprofit organization. How is this private property sort of permanently open to the public? We'd want to know about that, I suppose. But
Yeah, and again, what are your partnerships with that are making it open to the public? Who's kind of coming and participating in the program? So maybe we should meet and chat about it, Zach, if you want to move forward.
Sorry, I know we're just sort of flying through these to get through them, but feel free to reach out to Steph at any time, as she's mentioned, and I'm mentioning again. Andrea's asking what our definition of land and water is. I know Andrea's from Wild Seed Project, and they're a plant conservation organization. Does working with plants and building healthy ecosystems fit?
I would say land and water includes all of the beings in the land and water. Like there's not a separation. So very open concept. Land includes everybody on the land, in my opinion. But I don't know how the grant committee sees it. So yes, I think plants are definitely a huge part of the land and would be a fit for that connection.
Agreed. Zach is asking, it looks like the 2022 grants were primarily between 10 and 15,000. Is that the right range this year? And yet the maximum request is 15,000. So it can be anywhere from $1 to 15,000. I think is the answer to that question. I keep doing this wrong. Sorry, do you have another thing to add,
No,
Steph?
that's good. Keep going.
Jesse is asking, if we fiscally sponsor another project that is also interested in applying, can both apply? For context, it's the model of fiscal sponsorship where the fiscally sponsored entity is considered a project of the sponsoring organization. I think generally our rule at the Maine Community Foundation is if you fiscally sponsor someone, you can also apply for your own project. You couldn't obviously both apply for the same project, but I think that answers that question.
So just to clarify, a fiscal sponsor can apply at the same time as the project they're fiscally sponsoring, or basically like can be in the same pool at the same time.
Yes.
Knowing that it is a competitive pool, but that's fine to do, but you'd be both, in the same pool competing for the same award.
And then the last one we've got so far, this is a really interesting question. Would advocacy in support of the Maine Trails bond be fundable? My organization is leading on this issue, and the bond would offer grants to communities to create accessible, sustainable trails. And that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure the answer to that. Steph, do you have any thoughts?
I almost wonder if the organization is an association of land trusts, then maybe it would be a fit for general support. So that could look like funding whatever type of advocacy work you're doing for, it sounds like really you're focused on more systems change for creating accessible and sustainable trails. I would also maybe advise that if you think about applying for general support, then again, having those specific community partners or partnerships that are representing the communities that are supposed to benefit from these trail accessibility. So if you're a land trust association or coalition of land trusts, you could apply for general support to do this systems change, but making sure you have the communities that are supposed to benefit involved in the design, implementation, or evaluation, so that there's representation from the community saying that, yes, we want this advocacy on our behalf. That's kind of like, we're like a broken record for all of our grant programs on this, particularly our community building grant program, which that also might be a fit for you. The Maine Trails bond question, that community building grant program opens in November, but has similar guidelines around like the community benefiting from this advocacy work should be involved in the design, implementation, evaluation, or planning in some way.
And we had a little follow-up.
Okay.
So they're not a land trust. So they wouldn't qualify for the general operating, but I do think it would be reasonable to request a project. It's a little bit different than the other proposals we often see. So it's hard to predict exactly how our advisors would sort of look at that, but I think it would be really interesting. And it certainly seems to me that it fits into sort of the guidelines of the program.
And I would also add from our other grant programs as well, because all of our grants are managed by these community advisors. Trying to, if it's a coalition building or systems level type proposal, trying to get as clear as possible on what you mean and what you're doing and who your partners are. Because I've sometimes found that when folks in the sector can get really jargony and 10,000-foot level, sometimes the community advisors might not really understand the impact on the community that this might be having. So if any of you are thinking about like a coalition building or advocacy or systems change type proposal, trying to really bring it home when you're in your application, thinking that a community advisor's reading this and might not understand what you're talking about. So getting as specific as possible on who's involved in this and what the impact's going to be. And that's always hard as a fellow grant writer to distill it down. But sorry if that's annoying advice, but I'm just seeing that like the advisors can sometimes get a little lost in the jargon. So just trying to keep bringing it home for people on what you're talking about here, because this is big stuff.
You got a thanks. That was very
Okay.
helpful. And also just a comment that Maine Community Foundation doesn't often respond well to advocacy, but I think we would like that not to be true. So I think it would be great for you to apply for something like this. And that's something that I think both Steph and I would like that comment to not be true. So, yeah, I don't know really what the history is there, but yeah, I think that's all we've got so far.
Can all the participants see the answered section of the question
I
and
believe
answer?
so.
Just in our last couple minutes, I just want to make sure people can see there's some good questions in here about flexibility on the operating budget. So there's no hard cap on your operating budget, but it is a priority given that these are small grants, that they would have a big impact for a smaller, more grassroots organization. So no cap on the operating budget. In terms of the average budget of the organizations awarded or on the call, I don't have that number in front of me, but I could try to pull that up. That's and this is Sarah Robinson. I'm happy to meet with you too to talk through this a bit. Dakota had a great question about serving LGBTQIA plus community members. That sounds like a great fit for the program. Kat had a question about serving elderly and aging folks. That sounds like it could be a great fit for the program. We talked about Rebecca's question, and then we talked about the rest of them. Okay. Any other questions? And you should be able to, in our last couple minutes, like raise your hand if you want to like verbally ask a question, or you can type it in if you've thought of one.
I think we've answered all questions and it's completely clear. Yeah, as Steph mentioned, we're here to answer your questions. We know this can be a little complicated sometimes. So if you're unsure, please reach out because that can be the best way to help your proposal.
Yes, and I am putting again my contact info here because I'd love to meet with you. I'm getting to know all of our grantees, so don't hesitate to reach out. Another little plug, similarly, I'm managing the Maine Land Protection Program, and if you're interested in becoming a reviewer for that, we can discuss the Maine Land Protection Program as well. And highly recommend going to our site and seeing the other grant programs that are upcoming as well. If you're kind of leaving this webinar thinking maybe your project's not a fit for Conservation for All, there could be another grant program that might be a fit instead. I'm like starting my outro music. Folks have any more questions?
All right, I think we're good.
Okay.
It was nice to see you all today, and thanks for taking the time to listen to us for a little while.
Yes. Hope everyone has a good rest of your day and that you get to enjoy some of this nice weather. Thank you.